In the video, we explore key events on the southern, eastern, and far eastern fronts of the Russian Civil War, including the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and its historical role. During the first period of the Russian Civil War, which began in late 1917 after the Bolshevik seizure of power and continued until November 1918, most fighting was sporadic, involving only small groups, and the strategic situation was unstable and rapidly changing. During the second period of the war, which lasted from January to November 1919, the White Army's offensive from the south, east, and northwest was initially successful, forcing the Red Army to retreat on all three fronts. Following a series of Red Army setbacks at the front during this period, Bolshevik military commissar Trotsky introduced increasingly stringent measures to prevent unauthorized retreats, desertions, and mutinies within the Red Army. On the battlefield, the Cheka's special investigative troops followed the Red Army, conducting field tribunals and summary executions of soldiers and commanders who deserted, retreated from positions, or failed to demonstrate sufficient offensive zeal. In August 1918, the Bolsheviks authorized the formation of barrier troops, which were stationed behind unreliable units of the Red Army and were given orders to shoot anyone who retreated from the front line without permission. In 1919, the Bolsheviks allied with the Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine. After a series of battles, supported by the insurgent army's offensive on the White Supply Lines, the Red Army defeated the White Army on the southern front in October 1919. By the beginning of 1918, the Russian army had fallen apart, soldiers were deserting en masse, the front had collapsed, and Russia had lost the war. The fate of Russia was in the hands of the Central Powers as the victors. On the 22nd of December 1917, in Brest-Litovsk, following the armistice, negotiations began between Russia and the Central Powers. On the 25th of December 1917, the Ukrainian People's Republic was invited to participate in the peace negotiations and sent its representatives to Brest-Litovsk to negotiate Ukraine's independence. During the talks, the Central Powers made demands on the regions they occupied, including Poland, Lithuania, and Western Latvia. The Bolshevik delegation, led by Leon Trotsky, intended to prolong the negotiations in anticipation of revolutions in Central Europe, which ultimately led to the breakdown of the truce. On the 18th of February 1918, German and Austro-Hungarian forces launched a major offensive against Soviet forces, called Operation Faustschlag, meaning fist punch, also known as the 11 Days War. As a result of the offensive, the Central Powers captured vast territories in Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine. German forces were now 160 kilometers, about 100 miles, from Petrograd, forcing the Soviets to move their capital to Moscow. The rapid and successful advance of the German and Austro-Hungarian troops led to the Bolsheviks' acceptance of the demands of the Central Powers and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on 3 March 1918. According to the treaty, Russia renounced all territorial claims in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, most of Belarus and Ukraine. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk deepened opposition to Bolshevik rule and accelerated the descent into full-scale civil war. The primary Russian military political force opposing the Bolsheviks was the White Movement, whose armed units were known as the White Army. In February 1917, Alexei Kolodin, a cavalry general and former commander of the 8th Russian Army during the First World War, was elected Ataman of the Don Cossack host, the Assembly of the Don Cossacks. Politicians and army officers hostile to the Bolsheviks were drawn to the Don Cossack host after Kolodin publicly offered refuge to opponents of Soviet power. After the 15th of November 1917, Ataman Kolodin, together with the former chief of the General Staff of the Russian Imperial Army, General Mikhail Alexeyev, and General Lav Kornilov, began organizing a new army, which, by the end of December 1917, was named the Volunteer Army, also known as the Southern White Army. On the 2nd of December 1917, a military group of Whites, together with Cossacks, managed to recapture Rostov-on-Don from the local Bolshevik Red Guard. However, by the end of February 1918, the Bolshevik Red Army's offensive from the north compelled the Volunteer Army to retreat from Rostov-on-Don to the Kuban, where it aimed to join the Kuban Cossack formations. This retreat became known as the Ice March, also called the First Kuban Campaign. Most Kuban Cossacks did not support the Volunteer Army, and only 3,000, led by General Viktor Pokrovsky, joined it at the end of March 1918. In April 1918, during the Volunteer Army's attempt to seize Yekaterinoдар, General Kornilov was killed. General Anton Denikin assumed command, and the army retreated to the Don River. After the death of General Kolodin, General Pyotr Krasnov, elected Ataman of the Don Cossack host, negotiated with the German occupation forces in Ukraine to secure German army's support. As a result, the German Empire helped Krasnov arm the Cossack army that expelled the Red Army from the Don region in June 1918. On the 9th of June 1918, the Volunteer Army launched the Kuban Offensive, also called the Second Kuban Campaign, with the support of the Don host, led by Ataman Krasnov. In the autumn of 1918, Great Britain, France and the United States increased logistical assistance to the Volunteer Army. By the end of 1918, Denikin defeated the 11th Soviet Army and captured the entire Kuban and the North Caucasus region. On the 8th of January 1919, Denikin became Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Southern Russia, which merged the Volunteer Army with the Don Army. Denikin's Chief of Staff was General Pyotr Wrangel, the veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War. After capturing Donbass, Tsaritsyn, modern Volgograd, and Kharkiv in June 1919, Denikin launched the advance on Moscow on the 20th of June. At first, the White Army was victorious, capturing significant territory from the Bolsheviks. However, the seizure of the territories, contrary to the Whites' expectations, weakened them. The newly drafted conscripts were unwilling to fight, and the front line lengthened dangerously. Rampant corruption, anti-white uprisings, and political struggles between white generals and Cossack leaders destroyed the rear and unity of the armed forces of southern Russia. In October 1919, Red Army counterattacks forced the White Army to retreat to the Kuban region and the Crimean Peninsula. The defeat of the Moscow offensive marked the prelude to the Whites' final collapse in the conflict. In March 1920, the Red Army forced the Whites to retreat from the North Caucasus and the Kuban to the Crimean Peninsula during the evacuation of Novorossiysk, also known as the Novorossiysk Catastrophe. About 40,000 soldiers were evacuated by Russian and Allied ships, leaving behind their horses and heavy equipment. Around 20,000 soldiers remained behind and were either dispersed or captured by the Red Army. Many of those captured were subsequently executed. In Crimea, Denikin, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Southern Russia, relinquished all his authority to General Wrangel, who transformed these units into his Russian army, commonly known as the Army of Wrangel. By the end of October 1920, the Red Army expelled Wrangel's forces from northern Taurida and forced the Whites to retreat to Crimea. In early November, during the siege of Perekop known as the Perekop-Chonga operation, the Red Army broke through the White Army's fortifications. It launched a victorious offensive into Crimea with an invasion force 4 times larger than the White Russian army defending it. Consequently, Wrangel's army retreated to the Crimean ports, from where it was evacuated in an organized manner by Entente ships to Istanbul on 16 November 1920. After defeating Wrangel's army in Crimea in 1920, the Bolsheviks executed about 50,000 soldiers and civilians who had surrendered in the hope of a promised amnesty. During the First World War, the Czechoslovak Legion, made up of Czech and Slovak volunteers, fought alongside the Russian Empire. The volunteers sought to secure Entente's support for the independence of the Czech lands from the Austrian Empire. After the Bolshevik coup and the Bolsheviks' announcement of withdrawal from the war, the soldiers of the Czechoslovak Legion chose to fight against the Central Powers on the Western Front. Due to the blockade of all Russian European ports, they could only access the Western Front through Vladivostok, the Pacific port. By May 1918, the Czechoslovak Legion stretched along the Trans-Siberian Railway from Penza to Vladivostok. On 14 May 1918, the Bolsheviks in Chelyabinsk attempted to disarm the legionnaires and arrest some of them. In response to the Bolsheviks' actions, the Czechoslovak Legion took control of the Trans-Siberian Railway, thereby initiating the revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion. The Legion effectively became a strong, autonomous force in Siberia, leading to its military operations alongside the White Army. The Bolsheviks' defeat by the Czechoslovak Legion in Siberia allowed anti-Bolshevik and White Guard groups to overthrow them in Petropavl and Omsk. By the autumn of 1918, the Legion no longer participated actively in the Russian Civil War. In October 1918, Czechoslovakia was proclaimed independent. In November, the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the end of the First World War heightened the Legion members' wish to leave Russia. Between December 1919 and September 1920, the Legion was evacuated by sea from Vladivostok. In the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Bolsheviks due to the Czech Legion's military actions in the summer of 1918, several white movement governments were established, including the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, Russian abbreviation Komuch, in Samara, the Provisional Siberian Government in Omsk, and the Provisional Regional Government of the Urals in Yekaterinburg. After the formation of the Provisional All-Russian Government, also known as the Directory, in September 1918, all these governments recognized this new authority. On 18 November 1918, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, supported by cadets, army officers, and Cossacks, executed a coup d'état against the Directory, known as the Kolchak coup or the Omsk coup, which resulted in his proclamation as supreme ruler of Russia. On 4 March 1919, the Western Separate Army, commanded by Kolchak, initiated the White Army's spring offensive on the Eastern Front. As a result, the White Army achieved a strategic breakthrough in the center. However, the Red Army prepared a counteroffensive on the southern flank, which was successfully launched at the end of April 1919. The White forces managed to re-establish a front line along the Ishim and Tobol rivers. Meanwhile, the Red Army faced Anton Denikin's armed forces of southern Russia advancing towards Moscow from the south. Kolchak alienated potential allies, including the Czechoslovak Legion and French General Maurice Janin, head of the Entente military mission in Siberia. Following Kolchak's coup against the Provisional All-Russian Government and the establishment of his military dictatorship, the Czechoslovak Legion declined to take part in military operations. It solely guarded the Trans-Siberian Railway, along which the Legion moved to Vladivostok. The Japanese feared Kolchak would interfere with their occupation of the Russian Far East and refused to assist him. By the end of November 1919, Admiral Kolchak had lost control of his government, which compelled him to resign his command and appoint General Grigory Semyonov as the new leader of the White Army in Siberia. Following military defeats and political isolation, Kolchak was arrested by the Czechoslovak Legion while traveling to Yakutsk and handed over to the political center, which the Mensheviks and left socialist revolutionaries controlled. A few days after Kolchak's arrest, power in Yakutsk was seized by the Bolsheviks, who executed Kolchak on 6 February 1920. By autumn 1919, following the defeat of Denikin's White Army, the Red Army managed to transfer reinforcements to the Eastern Front. In mid-October, the Red Army broke through the defenses on the Tobol River, causing the White forces to retreat to Omsk. After the defeat of the White Army near Omsk, which the Red Army captured on 14 November 1919, the White Army began their retreat from Omsk to Cheta, also known as the Great Siberian Ice March. Cheta, the city where the White Army arrived at the end of March 1920 after its retreat, was the capital of the Russian Eastern Okraina, meaning outskirts, the territory controlled by Grigory Semyonov, Kolchak's successor, the commander of the White Transbaikalian Army, and the ataman of the Baikal Cossacks, who received Japanese military aid. The Bolshevik command ordered the Red Army not to advance beyond Yakutsk to avoid conflict with Japan. In July 1917, Grigory Semyonov received orders from the Russian Military Commission of the Provisional Government to organize an irregular military unit made up of Transbaikal Cossack, Mongolian, and Buryat cavalry forces. Following the Bolshevik coup in November 1917, Semyonov launched an anti-Soviet uprising in Transbaikalia. By August 1918, he had strengthened his hold over the region, and on 6 September, his forces seized Cheta. At the beginning of 1919, Semyonov proclaimed himself the ataman of the Transbaikal Cossack host. Units of the White Army that reached Cheta following the Great Siberian Ice March merged with Semyonov's forces, forming the Far Eastern Army. By 15 October 1920, the Japanese expeditionary force had been withdrawn from Transbaikalia, allowing the Red Army and Red Partisans to increase pressure on the Far Eastern White Army and extend Bolshevik control into the territory of the Eastern Okraina. As a result, by November 1920, the Far Eastern Army had evacuated to the Russian Primorye region, where the main ammunition and weapons depots were situated. These White troops actively took part in overthrowing the Bolshevik government of Primorye and in establishing the authority of the Provisional Primary Government. In October 1922, after the Japanese left the Amur region, the Red Army absorbed the territory. In September 1921, an anti-Bolshevik uprising erupted in Yakutia, known as the Yakut Revolt or the Yakut Expedition, led by the Kornet, equivalent to a modern second lieutenant, Vasily Korobeinikov, who commanded a detachment of 200 soldiers. In March 1922, in Chepcha, the Whites and Yakut nationalists founded the Provisional Yakut People's Government, aiming to secure regional autonomy or independence from Soviet control. Korobeinikov proclaimed himself as commander-in-chief of the Yakut People's Army, which comprised Cossack detachments. On the 23rd of March, the Yakut People's Army, equipped with 6 machine guns, seized the central city of Yakutsk. The Red Army garrison was overwhelmed. On the 27th of April, the Russian Bolshevik government declared the Yakut Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and sent a military expedition to subdue the uprising. During the summer of 1922, the Whites were expelled from Yakutsk and retreated to the Pacific coast. They occupied the port towns of Yakutsk and Ayan and sought assistance from the Provisional Primorye government in Vladivostok. On the 2nd of September, the White Siberian Volunteer Squad, commanded by Lieutenant General Anatoly Pepelayev, who had arrived on ships from Vladivostok, landed at Ayan. By the end of October, when Pepeliev's troops captured the village of Nelkan, he learned that the Bolsheviks had taken control of the territory of the Provisional Primorye government, which had been overthrown. By January 1923, the Siberian Volunteer Squad had seized the settlements of Ayan, Yakutsk, Nelkan, Ust-Maya, Ust-Mil, and Amga. On the 12th of February 1923, the Siberian Volunteer Squad was defeated by the superior forces of the Red Army near the village of Aboga. Following defeats at Yakutsk and the siege of Ayan, the Siberian Volunteer Squad surrendered on the 17th of June. Ayan was the last territory held by the Whites during the Russian Civil War. The White Movement was a coalition of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, and nationalists, which never formulated a coherent political program for Russia's future. The Whites mostly refused to back land reform, insisting on returning land to its pre-revolutionary owners. This alienated the peasantry, which made up the majority of the population. The White armies were divided, lacked unified leadership, and consisted of independent units commanded by different generals with their own agendas, which hampered coordination. White leaders advocated a unitary Russian state, rejecting autonomy and independence movements, which alienated Polish, Finnish, and East Baltic nationalists. The enemies of the White Movement, the Bolsheviks, had a clear, unified goal, such as the creation of a communist state, which helped inspire loyalty among their troops. The Red Army had a more unified command structure, and Leon Trotsky's ruthless leadership brought organization and discipline to the troops. The Bolsheviks held the most populated and industrialized part of Russia, which gave them a significant advantage in manpower and weapons, and where they received real popular support. In the following video, we explore the national separatism movement in Russia and its role in the Russian Civil War.